Hello, I'm Chris Busby. I'm speaking to you from the offices we have in the Latvian Academy of Sciences in Riga. And I want to talk to you about the nuclear test veterans case, which was heard in London 2 weeks ago. This is the Test Veteran Pension Appeal Tribunal. Now, in an earlier video which I made from Sweden, I mentioned that the evidence that I'd managed to get from under Freedom of Information Act in England had made it quite clear that the test veteran tribunals, the pensions appeal tribunals, could be won, and also the substantive case of the test veterans against the Ministry of Defence could also be won, because all of the evidence that the Ministry of Defence was putting forward in defence of their own case that the veterans had not received any significant radiation exposures, all of that evidence can be easily shown to be wrong. And the way in which it's wrong is that none of the measurements that were made by the Ministry of Defence and the people who were operating on the test sites at the time of the nuclear test, none of those people measured the internal radionuclide exposures to uranium or plutonium, those two alpha emitters, and also other internal radionuclide emitters, because none of the instruments that they had at the time could adequately measure these radionuclides. But of course there were samples taken, and what amazed me in the whole business was that we never actually ever saw any of the measurements that were made of these samples. We didn't see how much uranium there was on the ground, we didn't see how much plutonium there was on the ground. So I made various applications under the Freedom of Information Act, and they were stalled and stalled and stalled and stalled, and each time I made an application they just sent me documents that were irrelevant and so on. And eventually the judge in the tribunal, in the Pension Appeals Tribunal case, he ordered the court, he ordered the Ministry of Defence to release the evidence. And some of this evidence was released under the Official Secrets Act, and I was asked if I would sign the Official Secrets Act, but I refused to do that. But nevertheless, enough of this information came out from a Freedom of Information request as a result of the pressure brought to bear on the government, the British government, by the judge, Hugh Stubbs, for me to be able to analyse it and see what was really going on there. And so by the end of 2011, I had such a powerful case that it was quite clear that these veterans' appeals could be defeated. And in fact, I defeated the Ministry of Defence in several pensions appeals where individual cases were taken. So, for instance, in one case, I would go into court and I would argue that there was a lot of uranium and plutonium and so on the ground, and the case would be won. In fact, I did 5 of these cases and they were all won. And the 6th case I was coming up to was a case of a lady called Dawn Pritchard. And I think at that time the Ministry of Defence had enough. And I think I remember making a video which I put on YouTube, in which I said I thought they were going to settle, but actually they didn't settle. They didn't settle, so I was wrong. What they did instead was that they took all of the cases, all of the test veteran cases that had the pensions appeals. This is to say people were applying for pensions and the pensions were refused on the basis that these veterans had never really been exposed to radiation at all. And so they were appealing against this decision. And as I said, in the individual cases when I went in, we won each one of these cases one after another. So the Ministry of Defence knew that I was going to basically win all of them because I had all the evidence. And at that point, they decided that they weren't going to play that game anymore. So they took all of the veterans that were left, 16 of them, and by that time I had been engaged by all of the 16 of them to act as their expert witness. So I was the expert witness on all 16 of those cases. And they put them all into one huge case. So they said, we're going to hear all of this together in London. This was a couple of years ago that they said they were going to do this. It was quite astonishing because all of these veterans are from different places. I mean, some are from Australia, some are from Christmas Island. They had different cancers, they had different diseases. To put them all into one case is really rather silly. And at the same time, the government tried to get me kicked out as an expert witness. So they said, this man Busby is not an expert. You know, he has to prove that he is an expert before we'll allow him to come into court. Anyway, I did prove I was an expert. The judge allowed me in. I got various letters written by various people in America who I work for as an expert in courts in the United States. So that particular method of keeping me out that was done by the government, that didn't work. So something had to be done. Something had to be done. The government had to ensure that I was not allowed to give evidence, or of course they would lose the case again. Because by the end of 2011, the cases were in the bag for reasons which I will briefly outline. And the reason I'm here at the moment to talk to you about this is because something terrible has happened, something really criminal in my opinion has happened. And I'll explain. At the end of 2011, the solicitors who were acting for the test veterans, and the test veterans at that time were being helped by the Royal British Legion. And the solicitors who were being asked to help by the Royal British Legion were Rosenblatts. Now, I had already worked for Rosenblatts for 2 or 3 years on the substantive case of the test veterans. This is the case of the 900 test veterans who were taking a case for damages against the Ministry of Defence in the High Court. But suddenly, at the end of 2011, Rosenblatts pulled out. They just pulled out, just like that. Oof, they stopped. They were not going to act for the veterans anymore. There was no good reason given for this. And the reason I thought was that something had happened with regard to my various reports to the court that each time showed that the Ministry of Defence were lying. Each time that the Ministry of Defence came back with some argument, I could shoot it down. And I could shoot it down because of all this evidence that had come out under Freedom of Information Act. Top secret evidence, redacted evidence. Evidence that showed how much plutonium and uranium was in the bombs, because they had aircraft flying through the cloud at Christmas Island, Canberra aircraft. These young men were flying these aircraft to scoop up radioactive waste from the enormous mushroom cloud that was there. And the concentrations of radionuclides in the scoops were given in this evidence that was released under the Freedom of Information Act. So there was a lot of information there, and a lot of other information that showed that in fact this fallout from the clouds was falling on Christmas Island, if we're looking at the Christmas Island situation, and contaminating the veterans who were on the ground there, something which the Ministry of Defence said was impossible. So Rosenblatt suddenly pulled out, and there was a big gap, and everybody was freaking out. What on earth is going on? The Royal British Legion contacted me, and they said, "Oh, will you still act as an expert for us? We don't know what to do now. We need to know if you'll still act as an expert." So I said, "Okay, I'll act as an expert." And then the next I heard was about a month after this was a new firm of solicitors came in called Hogan Lovells International Limited. Quite out of the blue, Hogan Lovells decided that they were going to act for the veterans. But they didn't contact me. I just heard this from the Royal British Legion. And then the whole year passed, I hardly heard anything. I had a couple of brief letters from Hogan Lovells passing on some information from the court, asking me to respond to various Ministry of Defence arguments, which I did do. And then what happened was that 3 weeks before the tribunal case was due to be heard, 3 weeks before the tribunal case was due to be heard, I had a letter from Hogan Lovells saying, "We're not going to use you as an expert witness." So all of the 3 years' work that I did, all of that evidence that I got out under the Freedom of Information Act, all of those reports that I wrote for this case, which would have won the case, and which did win the case for the other litigants that I represented individually, all of that evidence was being kept out of the court. All of it. All of it. Isn't that extraordinary? Anyway, so what I did was I thought, well, I'm not going to take this lying down, because this is a very, very major item. I mean, the test veterans themselves are being betrayed by this. Because the witnesses, the expert witnesses that Hogan Lovells were intending to use, I knew these witnesses, and I mean, one of them had worked for the nuclear industry. I'd seen the reports from the other ones. None of those reports had brought in the evidence that I was due to give in court. And the most important evidence that I was due to give in court, evidence which had won the other cases, was evidence about the about the International Commission on Radiological Protection, about the risk model, the radiation risk model, which increasingly has been shown to be completely wildly wrong with regard to exposure to uranium and plutonium and these internal radionuclides that we're talking about. So all of that evidence is going to be kept out, but even more serious was evidence that had come out under the Freedom of Information Act, which described the fallout over Christmas Island, because a lot of these veterans were veterans of the Christmas Island tests. Christmas Island in the Pacific is where the British nuclear megaton tests were carried out, where they dropped the hydrogen bombs that they had developed. And I'll talk to you about one of these bombs, which was called Grapple Y. And Grapple Y was a big mistake. Grapple Y caused an enormous amount of fallout to land on the island. And we know this from this information that came out under the Freedom of Information Act. But anyway, the point is none of this stuff is going to be in the court. And therefore, probably, a lot of those veterans will not get justice, in my opinion, because the evidence is not there to show that they were exposed. And so the Ministry of Defence will argue that their radiation film badges didn't show a big enough dose, and therefore whatever cancer or condition that they're appealing about was not caused by radiation. So let's just now look at briefly at the evidence that is being kept out of the court. And because of what's happened, I'm going to put all of this evidence on the internet. So you will find all of this evidence at the Green Audit website, www.greenaudit.org, or you will find it on various other websites that I will show in this video that I'm making now. So you'll be able to go there and get all of the evidence that I've produced for the nuclear test veterans. Yeah. So at least then it's in the public domain. This is normally evidence that, of course, would be heard only by the court, and a lot of this evidence is semi-secret evidence that came out with great difficulty. The first thing that you need to know is that the evidence from one of the reports that I got from the case, from the Freedom of Information requests, was a paper by a man called Oldbury, A.E. Oldbury, who worked for the atomic weapons establishment in Aldermaston. And in 1963-64, he visited Christmas Island and made various measurements on the runway of the airport, of the airfield at Christmas Island. And usefully for me, these measurements contained they contained gamma radiation measurements and beta radiation measurements at the same position. So one could work out the beta-gamma ratio. Now this may sound very complicated and arcane, but actually from the beta-gamma ratio you can tell what the radionuclides are on the ground. And from the particular measurements made by Oldbury, it was possible to show that there was, even in 1963, after they'd done all the cleanups, there was an enormous amount of uranium on the ground. Uranium. Now the point about uranium is that we know from the other work that we've done in Iraq, in Fallujah and in the Balkans, that uranium particles produced in an explosion and inhaled cause massive, massive genotoxic damage. In Iraq, we found huge increases in leukemia, we found enormous death rates in children, we found a lot of congenital anomalies. So we know that uranium is bad stuff. And the main fallout component on Christmas Island, and this will not go into the court, nobody will talk about uranium. The main component of the fallout which caused the problems in the test veterans and in their children is uranium. And we found a lot of uranium in this Oldbury report, Christmas Island report, and that was a report which I used in the other test veteran cases which I won, the 5 cases which I won. The second thing that we did was we managed to get hold of the temperature. The meteorological records, they send off balloons at the time of the Christmas Island tests, and you could from the data that I got see the temperature at different altitudes. So you could see what was happening as the bomb exploded, the big Grapple Y bomb, which I'm talking about now. Now the grapple Y bomb, we also had photographs, which I think actually were secret photographs, which I got in error, in fact, from the solicitors. And I think this may be one of the reasons they don't want me in court, because these photographs, which I should put on the internet, are sequential photographs of the bomb actually exploding, the grapple Y bomb. So you have a freeze frame, freeze frame, freeze frame, freeze frame of the bomb exploding. It was taken by one of the Canberra aircraft which was flying, or the Lancasters which were flying and watching the whole process. And if you look at these particular sequential photographs of the bomb exploding, the grapple Y bomb, what you see is an enormous amount of seawater being sucked up into the plume. So there's they drop the bomb from an aircraft, there's a Vulcan, there's an enormous bang. The pressure wave goes down and it hits the surface of the sea and pushes it aside. And then the sea comes back again, hits in the middle and throws a load of water up into like a water spout, up into the bomb. Now, of course, the bomb, the temperature is enormously high, and so the air is rising very rapidly. And it sucks all this water from the sea up into the stem of the bomb. And in fact, we have eyewitness evidence from some of the veterans who are still alive, who say that fish were falling out of the sky after the test, that it rained heavily and fish fell out of the sky. Well, of course, not only fish fell out of the sky, all the radionuclides from the bomb fell out of the sky with the fish. And the other thing that we got under the Freedom of Information Act was a letter from somebody from Aldermaston, from the Atomic Weapons organisation in Aldermaston, to somebody on Christmas Island saying, if it rains, they said, if it rains, what you have to do is you have to take all of your filters and all of your fallout collection devices out of the rain, because otherwise the sticky filters will get wet and they won't work. So you can see that if all of this fallout came down onto the ground, and all of the sticky filters which were there to measure fallout were taken inside, of course there would have been no fallout measured on the sticky filters. On the other hand, if the sticky filters were left out in the rain would wash the fallout off the sticky filters. So either way, you're not going to get any radionuclides, any fallout in the sticky filters. So all of the records of the Ministry of Defence, which they've been using in this case, are complete nonsense. Right. Now, the other thing we found out about that bomb, the grapple Y bomb, and something that the Ministry of Defence have been forever saying in all of their arguments, right back in the Rosenblatt cases and so on, is that they only exploded the bomb when the wind was blowing out to sea. So it's Christmas Island, there's Christmas Island. You can see all this. I shall put it all on the internet. The wind was blowing slightly offshore, diagonally offshore, at the time that they dropped the grapple Y bomb. This was the big megaton bomb, 3 megatons. Woomph. So the fallout, they said, the fallout would blow out to sea, safely out to sea. Nobody can be hurt. But what they didn't say, and what you get from the balloon measurements, is that as you go up in height, the wind changes direction. So although the wind was blowing out to sea at the ground level, where the bomb exploded, at higher levels, above about 30,000 feet, the wind just changed around completely and started blowing over the island. So my colleague Di Williams and I, we looked at modelling the tracks of this plume, because the plume goes right up to 50,000 feet. It goes up to the tropopause. This is an enormous bomb. The idea of it going out to sea is really quite laughable, because Christmas Island is approximately 30 miles from north to south, and the diameter of the mushroom cloud is more than 30 miles. So it just goes bang, produces this enormous mushroom cloud, which then drifts out to sea at the base, of course, but as it goes up, it drifts back over the island. And then it rains, of course, it rains out of this cloud, including fishes, which have been sucked up into the cloud, and all of the uranium, of course, because the bomb is made of uranium. The bomb is made of uranium. Tons and tons of uranium is the bomb. I mean, it has a plutonium core and so forth, but the bomb itself is uranium, because they have to reflect the neutrons into the centre. And there's another question about that, which also is interesting. Anyway, so up it goes. It gets caught in the jet stream, blows in the opposite direction over Christmas Island, and then it rains. The rain comes down, piddly, 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 piddly with this fish, and then the low-level winds then blows it back over the island. So there was a lot of uranium on the island. And we also know that because actually, a long time after this, the New Zealand team came and measured radionuclides on the island, and they were looking for cesium mainly, and they found a bit of it. But what they also found was uranium. And they said, we found natural uranium on the island. Of course, it wasn't natural. There's no natural uranium on a coral island. Well, not very much anyway. They certainly found a lot of it. Okay, so that's the second point. The second point is that the measurements made by the Canberra bombers, and the height, the temperature with height and so on, and the pictures showing the water being sucked up into the plume, showed that there was no question that there was a lot of radioactive rain that fell on those people. And that would have brought down alpha emitters which are not detected by film badges. So so there's one. Now there's one more point too. What's this one? Oh yes, that's right. This is the final one. The aircraft that flew through the plume and collected the dust. This is the plume of the Grapple Y. They actually showed that the amount of uranium in that plume was enormously high. And in fact, if you back calculate from the data that I got under the Official Secrets Act, what you find is that the bomb contained about 4 tons or more of uranium. I mean, it's hard to believe, but it's possible that the bomb was just a big fat uranium bomb. And in fact, quite some time ago, about 2004, I think, there was a program on the radio under the series Document. You can look at the Document series. It's on the Radio 4 website, and I was involved in that program. And what that program said is that the atomic weapons establishment didn't know how to make a bomb. So when they were making the atomic bombs at Christmas Island, it was mainly to impress the Americans so that they could get the American formula for making atomic bombs. What that program suggested from all of the documents which they discovered is that they hadn't a clue how to make an atomic bomb, and that their fallback position was to make an enormous fission bomb out of masses of uranium-235. And I wonder if maybe that's why I've been kept out of this case, because they don't want anyone to suggest the possibility that they never made an H-bomb, that actually it was the U-235 bomb, a very large fat one. And I have to say that they've taken that program off the BBC record. So if you go back to the Document series and you go to the archives for the Document series on the website of the BBC, you'll find that program doesn't exist. It's disappeared. It's called H is for Hoax Bomb or something like that. Anyway, it's gone. They've taken it down. So maybe it was all a hoax, and there was never an H bomb. There was just an enormous bomb made of... we'll ignore that. There was an enormous bomb made of uranium. Right. So let's just finish this off now. I contacted Rosenblatt's and I contacted Hogan Lovells, and I said that I didn't understand why it was that they weren't allowing me to be an expert witness. And they wrote back and they said, oh well, we have problems with your credibility, this and that. And I wrote back and I said, well, how can you have problems with my credibility? I've won 6 cases in a row, and my credibility is the same as it was then. So why is it that I'm not on the case? And then I contacted the individual test veterans, the 16 test veterans. I wrote to them, I sent them letters. And I got a letter back from 2 of them and an email back from 1 of them. And they said they had no idea that I'd been taken off the case. Nobody had discussed it with them. Nobody has asked them whether I should be taken off the case. They had appointed me as their expert witness. And then I was taken off the case by some solicitors who hadn't bothered even to tell them. And for one of them, and this is really sad, Dawn Pritchard, whose case I was involved in long before they'd taken all of these and put them all in one bag. Poor Dawn Pritchard died. She died during this enormous period between the time I was going to take a case and the time it eventually came to court. She was dead. But here's the thing, Hogan Lovells didn't know this. She was still there on the list. So basically Hogan Lovells didn't know anything about the veterans. That Hogan Lovells had come in there as some sort of scam. This is my belief. Of course it may not be true. There may be some other perfectly reasonable explanation for this. But I find it hard to find any reasonable explanation that would keep out all of this evidence that I've been putting before you, and other evidence too, which I haven't got time to talk about, which are in all my reports. And the reason that I'm doing this, the reason I'm talking to you is this, that there are an awful lot of test veterans out there. There are an awful lot of people who were at these test sites and who were contaminated with material coming out of these bombs. And the material was coming down in the rain, and the material that was destroying their genetic makeup, their genomic identity, this material was mainly uranium. It was particulate uranium that they were inhaling, just as those people in Iraq were inhaling particulate uranium. And in that study that I did in 2007 of the British nuclear test veteran children, we found a 9-fold excess in congenital malformations in the children, and we found an 8-fold excess in congenital malformations in the grandchildren. And now where is that? Where have we done that again? We found it also in Fallujah, another case of exposure to uranium. So it comes back again and again to uranium. And you test veterans have got to continue fighting your corner for this. And you cannot trust everybody anymore. You cannot trust these solicitors. These solicitors have too much to lose, and the government is too powerful and can bring too much pressure on them. So that's about it, really. And thank you very much for listening to this. I hope I haven't bored you too much, but I felt it necessary to set the record straight. Thank you.